Hey guys, so we're always sharing a lot of tech tools and that's great, and I know that it's fun to learn how to use them, and it's a lot more fun when you have someone helping you learn how to use them. But we also still need to keep in mind that these tech tools are great, but they can't just be a worksheet on the screen. They have to be more in depth. They have to look more like good pedagogy, moving up the levels of blooms and, in the deeper thinking aspects of webs and so on. So here's a pedagogical style that worked really well for me in the breakout rooms. So you know how to use breakout rooms, you know how to use Google Slides, and I just incorporated podcasting in this, and then we kind of went from there. So I use this particular presentation with my multimedia and broadcasting students, and it talks about bias. So that's just a preface, but you can use any content and we can go from there. I worked with two teachers and kind of mashed their ideas together and made this unit. The Infogap I grabbed from Lisa Croce up at the high school. She presented this when we did a podcast presentation together. And this idea of sketchnoting, I worked with Lauren Retorto, and we use this idea of sketchnoting in our literature class, and it worked out really well. So I kind of put them all together, and this unit really was awesome and fun, and the kids were engaged and they were talking, and it was lovely. Okay, so the first thing I did was I identified their learning goals. So some of the things that we were particularly looking for in this podcast was listening for bias, listening to a presentation talking about voice and writing style, improving collaboration, which is something I know that we're all really striving to do. Learn a new method of note taking, which is where sketch notes came in, and analyze how bias works and how to identify it. I threw a little Socratic seminar down at the bottom here. So what is an infogap? It is when you take one piece of content and you group your students, you can put them in breakout rooms, and then you assign each part of the content to each student. So if I have a longer piece of content that I want the students to engage with, I'll give student A this beginning part, student B a middle part, student C another middle part, and student D the ending. Once the students learn that aspect of the content, then they come back to the group and they share what they learned to make a whole. You can do this in one of two ways. You can keep them in a whole group and tell them who their group members are, and they engage with the content on their own, and then you send them to breakout rooms, or you can send them to the breakout rooms and they divide and then conquer. Okay, so an infograph worked really great for me in my classroom, and I'm going to show you how I set it up. So if you don't know what a sketch note is, these are sketch notes. This was made by a student a couple years ago, and this is another one. So they're two very different. She actually went to go to Moore, and this student went to study engineering at Drexel. So obviously very different, but they can still do it. Okay, so as long as you can draw a stick figure, you can make a sketch note. All right, so here is another example of sketch notes from the Sylvia Duckworth, and there are more examples that I will add, but you don't have to be fancy. All it is, it's a different way to take notes. We do this a lot with vocab, draw a picture of the vocab, and it kind of just goes into that different part of the brain, and it's just a really good way for them to start digesting. As they're listening, it gives them something to do, so it focuses them a little bit. It allows them to actively listen a little bit more. So that's the purpose behind something like sketchnoting. All right, so as they're sketchnoting, I gave them some questions. And again, this was kind of, this definitely came from Lauren Retorto. She had some great questions. I just modified them to put them towards the content that I was teaching right now. What is the topic? And I made them do it together before they split the time up for the podcast. What is the problem, the solution, the information, the research that's presented? How do people deal with this information or with this content? How is the information presented? How is the solution revealed? What's the impact of the tone of the podcast? Because sometimes we find bias in the oddest places. How do the topics of our research connect to the podcast? So then we ultimately wound up, doing some type of research later on, but that's where that question came from. And these were their thinking questions for their sketch notes. Okay, I also added an explanation here. So I just used the insert audio feature in Google Slides, and I just added the audio right here so that after my explanation, when somebody had a question, they could listen to me explain it again. All right, so what is an infogap? And that's what this explanation is right here. And here's more explanation. We each have a piece of the whole, we divide and conquer, and it makes each student accountable for their particular section. Okay, it's kind of like putting together a puzzle. All right, so step one is to listen to the intro together. So they had to listen to the first portion of the podcast so they could get the gist. All right, the gist, and here's another audio clip for it. A gist is a general idea, the structure and tone. They had to divide and conquer, so each of them listened to approximately 5 minutes, and I gave them a visual of this later on in the slideshow. They listen to their particular section on their own, and they create a sketch note. After they created their hot questions, after they did their sketch notes, they are going to prepare an explanation that explains their sketch notes for the rest of the group to fill in the gaps. Okay, so they're going to explain symbols, they're going to explain quotes, they're going to explain the significance of any of the content that they have on their sketch note. They return to their groups who fill in the gap, and then they had to prepare 3 questions that center around their breakout room discussion. So they had to come back with these questions. Okay, they had to create their own questions, hot questions. Okay, so here are some question stems that they could use if they were really drawing a blank. And here is another explanation to help them identify how to use these. And then this is the podcast that they're going to listen to. Okay, so if they're, and I always try to explain to them what it looks like. So if they're in a group of 4, this is what it's going to look like. If they had a different size group, it's going to shift a little bit according to the time schedule. But I always try to make it at least like about a group of 4. All right, they would listen to this podcast. If they're a group of 5, this is how their group would go. I assign their groups so there's no questions. And then that's pretty much it. Then we come back and they lead the discussion using the questions that they created. You could also add the questions to like something like Wheel of Names. So then it's random. Instead of adding names, you just add the questions, and you can have them put the questions on a Google Doc where you can just copy and paste it into the Wheel of Names. And I'll show you how to do that later. But this was a very successful lesson in my class. My students really enjoyed this. Not only did they really enjoy the podcast and the information in the podcast and they understand the content, but they also learned how to listen to different evidence, how to work in a group. I tried to make it pretty structured so there was an activity that could be assessed throughout the actual lesson and throughout the actual content so that they were held accountable, because this is definitely a different way of teaching. We have to teach differently. It can't be the same old. So this was a great lesson that worked in my class. And if you'd like to collaborate where I could help you find some podcasts, or I could see how it fits maybe in a math class or a science class, we can definitely do that. Just reach out. I'm always around. If you have any questions, click on the Google Meet and I will be there and we can have a conversation about whatever you want. Okay, I hope to see you